According to Dr. Williams, I felt called to a ministry of preaching, teaching, and writing. So I have dedicated my life to these things. My life has been a quest to understand the truth as God gave me the light to see it, and to expound the truth as He gave me the ability to express it. And his life and ministry certainly is a testimony to that. He holds a BA degree from Taylor University and an MDiv from Taylor Evangelical Divinity School, a PhD in medieval and Renaissance literature from the University of Georgia. That's a school here in Georgia, isn't it? Okay, yeah, I think I've heard of it. In addition to serving as the department chair of the Humanities and Natural Sciences Department at Toccoa Falls College, he also is the author of several books, including Mere Humanity, G.K. Chesterton, C.S. Lewis, and J.R.R. Tolkien on the human condition. He's also written Inklings of Reality, Essays Toward a Christian Philosophy of Letters, and The Devil's Dictionary of the Christian Church, which is a very, very entertaining and engaging read. If you're unfamiliar with that book, of course we have it featured back there on the table. Dr. Williams is also an ordained minister in the Evangelical Free Church, and for many years has had pastoral experience. So it is indeed a great honor and privilege to have Dr. Don Williams with us this evening. So if you will, please extend a very warm welcome.
Ellen Sila Lumen Omen Tiermo. A star shines on the hour of our meeting. Or it would if the clouds would cooperate. But that is an elvish greeting which seems like a good way to begin tonight. Title of this lecture is An Encouraging Thought. It's taken from one of Gandalf's conversations with Frodo. Why did this ring have to come to me? And Gandalf says, well, Bilbo was apparently meant to find the ring and not by its maker. And that may be an encouraging thought. And when you think about that line, it becomes a more encouraging thought than most readers of Tolkien probably would ever have imagined. Because if Bilbo was meant to find the ring, there must have been someone to mean it. And what does that imply about the world of Middle-earth and about our world? Those are interesting questions. Now, Tolkien is a writer who was a very devout Christian, a very deeply thinking Christian, and a friend of C.S. Lewis. In fact, it was Tolkien's witness that led C.S. Lewis to Christ, one of the major influences in his conversion. And yet, as I've been part of Inklings studies for the last 30 years now, I begin to realize that there is an entire mass of people out there who have no idea that any of that is true. Tolkien's fan base consists of Christians like myself, and probably like many of you, who are drawn to him by, among other things, his friendship with Lewis and his profoundly Christian worldview. And then there's another group of them, probably half at least, who are the kind of people who are into Dungeons and Dragons, which the Lord of the Rings sort of inspired the creation of that game. And so you go to an Inklings conference, and half the people are evangelical Christians, and the other half are goths. You wonder what it is that can draw both of these groups together. The Christianity in Tolkien's work is buried much deeper, farther below the surface than it is in Lewis's. There's nothing in The Lord of the Rings, there's nothing in Middle-earth that corresponds to the stone table in Narnia, where it's almost impossible to miss the fact that not only is the biblical worldview being presented, but the gospel is being proclaimed. In Tolkien, it's much more subtle, but no less profound and no less biblical. But it's not obvious, and it's not obvious to a lot of Tolkien's fans. In fact, when you think about Middle Earth, you think about, of course, the One Ring, 3 rings for the elven kings underneath the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords and their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his throne in the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie. 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to bind them, to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the shadows find them in the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie. I recall hearing Priscilla Tolkien, Tolkien's daughter, talk about listening to the Lord of the Rings as bedtime stories when she was a little girl and being given nightmares by the Black Riders. Someone asked, well, did the Black Riders in the movies have the same effect? And she said, I should think not. That's what happens when you let vulgarity and commercialism into it, isn't it? But she had nightmares. You know, this is the kind of thing that a lot of Christian parents, it would be the last thing they would give their children. It's very dark. The darkness that threatens Middle Earth is every bit as dark as the darkness that threatens our own world. And so, when I first read The Lord of the Rings, it was 1968, summer of 1968, summer between my junior and senior year of high school. And I had no idea who Tolkien was. I was reading it because everybody was reading it. I did not know at that time that he was a believer. I did not know that he was a friend of C.S. Lewis. I had not yet heard of C.S. Lewis. It was Tolkien that led me to Lewis. Somebody said, if you like Tolkien, you ought to check out his friend, C.S. Lewis, and I did. But as I'm going through The Lord of the Rings, the thought kept forming in my head, if a Christian ever came alive to the beauty of the world and the mystery of life, this might be how he would write. At that point, in the fundamentalist church that I'd been raised in, it was completely inconceivable to me that such a thing could ever be. But I couldn't shake this thought. A Christian who really understood the world might write like this. It was only later that I would discover that in fact my hunch was correct. So what was it that gave me that idea? This talk was very inaccurately billed, The Life and Times of J.R.R. Tolkien. His life was from the 1890s to the 1970s, and that was also his times, and that's all I'm going to say about that. This is about Tolkien's theology. How did I know? Well, how did I guess? What made me think this? As I express it in Inklings of Reality, the thought even began vaguely coalescing in my mind that if a Christian ever really saw the mystery of life and became awake to the mystery of words, this would be how he might write. Well, what were some of those indications? I'm going to talk about a few of those things tonight. Things that struck me as amazingly biblical, as things that I wasn't used to finding in that same kind of combination in the same work of literature, even before I had any idea. One of the most pronounced motifs of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and The Silmarillion is the conflict between darkness and light. The land of Mordor where the shadows lie, and the elves who love starlight. Not by might, not by power, but by my spirit, saith the Lord. In Tolkien, it's not the great, mighty, magic-wielding wizard. It's not the accomplished swordsman. It's not Gimli and his axe or Legolas and his bow that win the war against darkness, although they have very important roles to play. It is the weakest of the characters that accomplish the mission, and it is precisely through their weakness that it is done. The motif of sacrifice and the motif of providence. Now, not everybody would necessarily see providence in The Lord of the Rings, but when I was a junior in high school, I was already a Bible nerd, so I maybe saw some things that not everybody sees. It was there. And finally, Christ figures. There's not a Christ figure in The Lord of the Rings, but there are characters, more than one, whose role in the story is too much like Christ for it to be a complete accident. So it was these kinds of things, and having them all together in combination, that kept making me think, this thing is incredibly biblical. So let's think for a few minutes about each of them. First, the motif of darkness and light. It runs through the whole thing. It's inescapable. Sauron is known as the Dark Lord. Mordor, where the shadows lie. The Black Riders. There are some people who will find an excuse to drag race into almost anything, and so there are people who criticize Tolkien as a racist because of... No, it's darkness versus light. On the other hand, you have Gandalf, who becomes the White Rider. Arendelle, the elf traveling the heavens, what we know as the star, or the planet Venus, the morning star, with the light from the Silmaril that gives hope to the elves. And the Phial of Galadriel, which contains light from that source. Light and darkness. It's hard to read more than a couple of pages without running into something that reminds you of this conflict. And it all comes together when Sam is on that journey into Mordor, and he is just about at the end of his rope and completely out of hope. And Sam manages to find his courage again by singing to himself this song. Though here at journey's end I lie in darkness buried deep, beyond all towers strong and high, beyond all mountains steep. Above all shadows rides the sun, and stars forever dwell. I will not say the day is done, nor bid the stars farewell. Light and darkness are not equal. This isn't the superficial, half-baked Tolkien wannabe like Star Wars, where you have the light side and the dark side of the Force, which are in perfect balance, and where it just doesn't make any sense, because Obi-Wan tells the newly minted Darth Vader, only a Sith deals in absolutes. Wait a minute, wasn't that an absolute statement? Only a Sith Lord, that's the ultimate dark side, guys. Only a Sith deals in absolutes, which is an absolute statement, which means Obi-Wan must be a Sith Lord. But wait a minute, if he's as much on the dark side as the light side, what is he fighting for? You know, the whole thing collapses. But with Tolkien, it doesn't. Light lasts. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it. You know, it's not a quotation, it's not even a paraphrase, but I couldn't escape, even as a high school student, the idea that it was an allusion to the prologue to John's Gospel. Sam saw a white star twinkle for a while. The beauty of it smote his heart as he looked up out of the forsaken land, and hope returned to him. There's a basis for hope in the fact that light is eternal and darkness is not. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it. For like a shaft clearing cold, the thought pierced him that in the end the shadow was only a small and passing thing. There was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach. Now, nobody with a secular worldview who's thinking straight could write this. Because, in fact, the stars are not eternal. They have a certain amount of atomic fuel. When they burn it up, they go supernova, and they go out. And if the secular account of the universe is true on an ultimate level, we're headed for the death of all that light. And when it's gone, the darkness will reign supreme forever. There can only be legitimate hope in the existence of light if light and darkness are not equal. So it's not just light and darkness, it's how they relate to each other in ways that keep reminding you that the light shines in the darkness and the darkness cannot overcome it. In the end, the shadow was only a small and passing thing. In a secular worldview, it's the thing that lasts forever. It's inescapable. But there was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach. Not by might, not by power. There's nothing more central to the basic plot of Tolkien's tale than this. The road must be trod, but it will be very hard, says Elrond, and neither wisdom nor strength will carry us far upon it. This quest may be attempted by the weak with as much hope as the strong. And so it's the hobbits, these country bumpkins who mostly pay no attention to anything going on outside the limits of their little protected land, who when somebody does take an interest in the issues of the larger world, that person is looked down upon. I mean, my goodness, if you go and have adventures, you can't be completely respectable. These little people who could not exist if they weren't constantly protected by the rangers, and they don't even know it. They appear out of nowhere to trouble the counsels of the great and the wise, and this quest may be attempted by the weak with as much hope as the strong. And it's not just that they're the little guys. It's not just that they're nobodies. Gandalf's the only one of the great and wise who pays any attention to them at all, because he is in fact the wisest. It is that it is precisely their weakness that is the key to the victory. When Frodo gets to Samath Naur, and he's on the point of throwing the ring into the fire and destroying it, he is finally overcome. And it's only because he loses the fight with Gollum, who bites his finger off and takes the ring from him and is dancing on the edge in triumph. It's the fact that Frodo has failed to resist the lure of the ring, failure, that puts him in the position where Gollum can steal it and fall off the cliff. It's weakness, the fact that he loses that fight. It's not just that it's the weak who achieve the quest, it is that their very weakness turns out in the overall wisdom of Iluvatar to be the key to the victory. It is off the course of the deeds that move the wheels of the world. Small hands must do them because they must, while the eyes of the great are elsewhere. Not by might, not by power. Sacrifice. I have been hurt too deeply, Sam, says Frodo, explaining why he ultimately has to pass over the seas from the Grey Havens and leave Middle-earth. I tried to save the Shire, and it has been saved, but not for me. It must often be so, Sam, when things are in danger. Someone has to give them up, lose them, so that others may keep them. Frodo doesn't live happily ever after. He doesn't go back to the Shire and live happily ever after. He has wounds that cannot be healed in this world, and he has given up the very thing he tried to save, and he thinks it's worth it. That's pretty amazing. We have anti-heroes nowadays. Heroes are supposed to be passé and not nearly ironic enough for our postmodern world. And so we have lots of stories now with heroes that don't really win. But they lose, and their loss is ultimately meaningless. Here is someone who freely makes decisions that cause him to give up things for others, and who concludes in the end that it's worth it. Providence. I can put it no plainer, said Gandalf, than by saying that Bilbo was meant to find the ring and not by its maker. And that may be an encouraging thought. Well, if Bilbo was meant to find the ring, there had to be someone to do the meaning, because meaning is a personal act. And if, in fact, Bilbo was meant to find the ring and not by its maker, then that means there's someone directing the course of events who is not Sauron, and who is in fact greater than Sauron. That's why this is an encouraging thought. I imagine Frodo was pretty much scratching his head as Gandalf was saying this, like, that's your idea of an encouraging thought? But when you think about it, it is, and it's only an encouraging thought if, in fact, meaning is a personal act. It's amazing. God is never mentioned in the Lord of the Rings itself. Kind of like the book of Esther. In the book of Esther, God is never mentioned, but he is there behind every word, working through those circumstances to save his people. And that's exactly the same thing that's happening here. In Peter Jackson's portrayal of that final climactic scene in Summit and Hour, the motif of providence isn't just here in Gandalf's little words, which I can find by unpacking them carefully. But the fact that Gollum is there at the end, Gandalf had predicted he's going to have something to do with this, and Bilbo's mercy in not killing him is going to rule the fate of many. And so in the book, the motif of providence comes to its ultimate fulfillment in that scene, where nothing Frodo does achieves the quest. In fact, Frodo's actions are all designed to make the quest fail. He yields to the temptation of the ring. He claims it for his own. And Sauron senses this, and the Nazgul are streaming toward the mountain. And then Gollum attacks him, and they fight on the edge of the cliff. Gollum bites off the finger and takes this isn't that ring, by the way. I'm not Tom Bombadil. If it were, and I didn't disappear, never mind. Gollum is dancing on the edge of the cliff in triumph, holding up the ring. Precious, precious! And he slips and falls. into the lava, and thus is the quest achieved. When Jackson films that scene, that's not good enough for him. He has to have Frodo and Gollum fighting on the cliff, and Frodo kicks Gollum off. I think he was trying to copy the scene in The Search for Spock, where Kirk throws Colonel Cruz, the Klingon commander, into the abyss. I mean, it's awfully close. Just as Legolas dancing down the trunk of the Oliphant is, I mean, Legolas and the Oliphant is Luke and the Imperial Walker. It's like, come on, if you're going to make stuff up, at least don't copy somebody else in doing it. But the motif of providence, the theme of providence, is horribly diluted in Jackson's telling of the scene. He sacrifices meaning for what seems to him like more drama. And this is why the more you love The Lord of the Rings, the less enchanted you are with Jackson's movies. He gets a lot of things right. He does most of the visuals wonderfully. And I watch the movies and I enjoy them because, I mean, Minas Tirith is Minas Tirith. And Edoras is Edoras. I mean, he gets so much of the visual part right. But then he's got to tinker with the plot. And he does it in ways that show that he does not really get what Tolkien was doing. So it's very important that it's Gollum's misstep, not Frodo's action, that causes the ring to end up being destroyed. So you find it in statements by significant characters which cannot be interpreted without implying the doctrine of God's providence. But even more than that, you find it in the whole plot, the structure of the story, which leads you to an ending which could only have happened if Bilbo was meant to find a ring and not by its maker. You were meant to be here tonight, and so was I. Whatever is happening in your life that seems like the biggest threat to you was meant to be there. That's no guarantee that you won't totally mess everything up and fail to get the benefit of it. But if it was meant to be, then there is a response on your part which God can enable. Yeah, this is an encouraging thought. It means that nothing can happen without his permission. Nothing can happen. Lots of really bad things can happen, but nothing can happen that is going to derail his plan. And the whole plot of The Lord of the Rings makes this really inescapable, especially in the books, not so much in the movies. Christ figures. Christ figures really are a little bit too obvious for Tolkien. Aslan, there's nothing in The Lord of the Rings like Aslan. There's no character that in fact represents Christ as he might have been if he had been incarnated in the third age of Middle Earth, as the fourth age, as he actually was. But there are characters, very significant characters, that are important heroes in the story precisely because there are aspects of Christ's character that are imprinted on them, and they wouldn't be who and what they are otherwise. We can think of the traditional way of understanding Christ as prophet, priest, and king. And if you think about that, all of a sudden, some of the important people in The Lord of the Rings start making a lot of sense. Gandalf would not be Gandalf if somewhere in the back of Tolkien's profoundly Christian mind was not Christ the prophet. Christ, the one who reveals God's word, not just by saying it, but by embodying it, by being it in the flesh. We're in Minas Tirith. The war is going very badly. The siege is about to begin. Gandalf has heard bad news that makes him really, really worried about what's happening with Frodo and Sam on their way to Mordor. And Pippin looks up. In the wizard's face, Pippin saw at first only lines of care and sorrow, though as he looked more intently, he perceived that under all there was a great joy, a fountain of mirth, enough to set a kingdom laughing, were it to gush forth. Now, I read that, and we know Gandalf is the prophet. He's the one who has the wisdom. He's the one who interprets the will and the intent of Iluvatar to the characters, although in The Lord of the Rings that's not made explicit, but it's there, as I've shown you, if you have the eyes to see it. And I think about Christ, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And yet, those who know him are supposed to be marked by joy. The joy of our salvation. And I think about Christ with the power of the kingdom hidden mostly under that weakness, but every once in a while, it's as if those robes part a little bit and some of the glory that really belongs to him shines forth. You see it in the miracles. You see it on the mountain of transfiguration. And ironically, you see it most powerfully of all at the cross. And while Christ takes on our sorrows, there is life in him. I came to bring life and to bring it more abundantly. And that's always there under the surface. And so I look into Gandalf's face and I see a reflection of Christ the prophet. Frodo and Sam represent the priestly aspect of Christ. Now, they don't die for other people's sins, but their sacrifice of lesser things achieves a lesser salvation. Not eternal salvation, but a temporal salvation for Middle-earth. And so in the aspect of sacrifice, they represent Christ as the priest. No taste of food, no feel of water, no sound of wind, no memory of tree or grass or flower, no image of moon or star are left to me. Frodo says in one of his moments of greatest darkness. Notice how moon and star are in the climactic position of that series of earthly blessings that hobbits seem to have the capacity of enjoying more than other races. Well, the elves probably appreciate the stars more than anyone, but Frodo and Sam are elf friends. They have known something of that. When Frodo says, no image of moon or star are left to me, I'm in total darkness here. The weight of the ring is bowing me down. I am naked in the dark, Sam, and there is no veil between me and the wheel of fire, which is what the ring has become to him. And so he embraces suffering, and that embrace is the path to salvation for Middle-earth. Frodo and Sam wouldn't be quite the characters they were if that aspect of Christ wasn't reflected in them. I'm not calling them Christ figures. There's no one, I mean, that's too big a job for anybody to do, unless you're Aslan. I mean, Aslan could kind of pull it off. But no human character or elf or wizard could really be a convincing Christ figure. It's asking too much. But by taking the three offices of Christ and dividing them up and letting his most important characters reflect them, you realize if Tolkien hadn't known Christ and known him really well, it would have been almost impossible for him to create these characters. There are aspects of Christ's character that are reflected in them, just as is supposed to be the case with us, or his followers. And then Aragorn, Christ the King, reflects Christ as the King. Thus spake Earith, the wise woman of Gondor, the hands of the king are the hands of a healer, and so shall the rightful king be known. That's probably about as close as Tolkien comes to a hint. He mostly leaves it to us to get these things if we can. And it's questionable even how much he had consciously thought about putting them there. But it's the way that the Christian faith had sunk so deeply into Tolkien's entire personality. I think you see it reflected in these moments and in these characters and these themes and motifs of the Lord of the Rings. Well, those were things I was seeing. Now, I wasn't seeing them quite as clearly, I don't think, in 1968 as I'm explaining them now. This was at that time more on the level of hunches. And I've spent, not even going to do the math, I've spent a lot of years since then thinking about this and putting it together, and you're getting the benefit of those years. So in 1968, these are hunches. They're like, I'm not even sure I could have named them all then, but they were things I was seeing. And then came the confirmation. The very first thing I did when I finished the last page of the appendices in Volume 3, the very next thing I did was turn back to page 1 of Volume 1 and start over. So I read The Lord of the Rings twice in 1968, and I've read it almost every year since then. It's one of my summer rituals. Every summer I read The Lord of the Rings to sort of clean my mind out from all the freshman papers I've read the year before and restore what few shreds of sanity I can still cling to, are mainly a result of that. The next thing I did after that was what you do when you find a writer that moves you deeply. I tried to get my hands on everything else he had written, which at that time wasn't very much. But it did include a little selection of shorter pieces called the Tolkien Reader. And the Tolkien Reader included the essay on fairy stories. And so Tolkien is talking about fairy stories and why they're important, why the imagination is important, and how they should be read and what they mean. And it's all very interesting. And then he sort of comes to the climax of his argument. And what else would you do at the climax of your argument but break into poetry? I mean, I do that. And Tolkien did as well. And this is what I found. Although now long estranged, man is not wholly lost nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned. Man, sub-creator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. What though every cranny of the earth we filled with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods and their houses out of dark and light and sowed the seed of dragons, 'twas our right. used or misused, that right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we're made. And at that moment, I slammed the book shut, put it down, and went out for a walk, because I had to assimilate what I had just read. My hunches had turned out to be true. Not only did Tolkien believe in explicitly biblical truths like creation specifically in the image of God, but those truths weren't things he just happened to believe. They were the very foundation on which he had built his whole philosophy, and which allowed him to write something like The Lord of the Rings. It was explicitly Christian ideas that weren't just there, but were central to who he was and how he wrote. And at that point in my life, as I was wrestling with whether it was actually possible to be a thinking Christian, because a lot of the people that I knew who were most committed to the faith at that point really kind of communicated the idea that that was an oxymoron. It was not only possible, but it was essential. Because either Tolkien was right or life was completely meaningless. Now, discovering C.S. Lewis, discovering Francis Schaeffer, helped a great deal in putting all that together, but the germ of the insight was there. Oh my goodness, I was right. He is a Christian. He doesn't just happen to be one, it's actually central to his thinking. Wow. I was, I should say, also greatly helped in that process of sorting all this out and putting it together by two friends of mine, one of whom is here tonight, David Gordon and Robbie Peel. We knocked our heads against each other weekly, if not daily, and spent a lot of time together, and we solved all the problems of the world 3 times over, and for some reason nobody paid any attention. So, you know, but Robbie, thanks for being part of my life in those days. You and David were more important than I can ever put into words. So it's confirmed. And then we come to the Silmarillion, which isn't published until a long time later. But I want to read you an extended passage from the Silmarillion, because here Tolkien actually finally puts it into the fiction and into the saga of Middle-earth explicitly. All that stuff that I showed you in The Lord of the Rings is actually there implicitly. Now it becomes explicit. Because the Silmarillion, lots of people have not been able, who love The Lord of the Rings, have not been able to get into it. It's not finished, it's not polished, it's put together by Christopher, Tolkien's son, from his scraps of notes and stuff. But it gives you a lot of information that's background, and the most important thing of all, and fortunately the one part of this thing that is as well written as anything Tolkien ever did, maybe the greatest thing he ever wrote, is the Aina Lundale, the creation story of Middle-earth. If you haven't read it, it's high time you heard it. There was Eru the One, who in Arda is called Ilúvatar, and he made first the Ainur, the holy ones, that were the offspring of his thought, and they were with him before aught else was made. And he spoke to them, propounding to them themes of music. And they sang before him, and he was glad. Before a long while they sang only each alone, or but few together, while the rest hearkened. For each comprehended only that part of the mind of Ilúvatar from which he came, and in the understanding of their brethren they grew but slowly. Yet ever as they listened, they came to deeper understanding and increased in unison and harmony. And it came to pass that Iluvatar called together all the Ainur and declared to them a mighty theme, unfolding to them things greater and more wonderful than he had yet revealed. And the glory of its beginning and the splendor of its end amazed the Ainur, so that they bowed before Iluvatar and were silent. Then Iluvatar said to them, "Of the theme that I have declared to you, I will now that you make in harmony together a great music. And since I have kindled you with the flame imperishable, you shall show forth your powers in adorning this theme, each with his own thoughts and devices, if he will. But I will sit and hearken and be glad that through you great beauty has been awakened into song." Like the children of Iluvatar, men and elves later, the Ainur are creative because they're made in the image of the Creator. And that's why they were made, so that through them, the creative work of Iluvatar himself should be unfolded. Then the voices of the Ainur, like unto harps and lutes and pipes and trumpets and viols and organs, and like unto countless choirs singing with words, began to fashion the theme of Iluvatar to a great music. And a sound arose of endless interchanging melodies woven in harmony that passed beyond hearing into the depths and into the heights. And the places of the dwelling of Iluvatar were filled to overflowing. And the music and the echo of the music went out into the void, and it was not void. Never since have the Ainur made any great music like to this one, though it has been said that a greater still shall be made before Iluvatar by the choirs of the Ainur and the children of Iluvatar after the end of days. Then the themes of Iluvatar shall be played aright and take being in the moment of their utterance. For all shall then understand fully his intent in their part, and each shall know the comprehension of each, and Iluvatar shall give to their thoughts the secret fire, being well pleased. But now Iluvatar sat and hearkened, and for a great while it seemed good to him, for in the music there were no flaws. But as the theme progressed, it came into the heart of Melkor to interweave matters of his own imagining that were not in accord with the theme of Iluvatar. The problem is not that he interwove things of his own imagining. The Ainur were in fact commanded to do that. You know, this is like it's like a great symphony that is a symphony of jazz musicians who are improvising on the theme and the chord progression they were given. The problem is Melkor's imaginings were not in accord with the theme, for he sought therein to increase the power and glory of the part assigned to himself. To Melkor, among the Ainur, had been given the greatest gifts of power and knowledge, and he had a share in all the gifts of his brethren. He had gone often alone into the void places, seeking the imperishable flame, for desire grew hot within him to bring into being things of his own. And it seemed to him that Iluvatar took no thought for the void, and he was impatient of its emptiness. Yet he found not the fire, for it is with Iluvatar. But being alone, he had begun to conceive thoughts of his own, unlike those of his brethren. Some of these thoughts he now wove into his music. And straightway discord arose about him. And many that sang nigh him grew despondent, and their thought was disturbed, and their music faltered. But some began to attune their music to his, rather than the thought they had at first. Then the discord of Melkor spread ever wider, and the melodies which had been heard before foundered in a sea of turbulent sound. But Iluvatar sat and hearkened until it seemed that around his throne there was a raging storm as of dark waters that made war upon one another in an endless wrath that could not be assuaged. Then Iluvatar rose, and the Ainur perceived that he smiled, and he lifted up his left hand, and a new theme began amid the storm, like and unlike yet to the former theme, and it gathered power and had new beauty. But the discord of Melkor rose in uproar and contended with it. And again there was a war of sound more violent than before, until many of the Ainur were dismayed and sang no longer, and Melkor had the mastery. Then again Iluvatar arose, and the Ainur perceived that his countenance was stern. And he lifted up his right hand, and behold, a third theme grew amid the confusion, and it was unlike the others. For it seemed at first soft and sweet, a mere rippling of gentle sounds and delicate melodies, but it could not be quenched and took to itself power and profundity, strength coming out of weakness again. And it seemed at last that there were two musics progressing at one time before the seat of Iluvatar, and they were utterly at variance. The one was deep and wide and beautiful, but slow and blended with immeasurable sorrow, from which its beauty chiefly came. The other had now achieved a unity of its own, but it was loud and vain and endlessly repeated. It had little harmony, but rather a clamorous unison as of many trumpets braying upon a few notes. It essayed to drown the other music by the violence of its voice. But it seemed that its most triumphant notes were taken by the other and woven into its own solemn pattern. In the midst of this strife, whereat the halls of Iluvatar shook and a tremor ran into the silences yet unmoved, Iluvatar arose a third time, and his face was terrible to behold. Then he raised up both his hands, and in one chord, deeper than the abyss, higher than the firmament, piercing as the light of the eye of Iluvatar, the music ceased. Then Iluvatar spoke, and he said, "Mighty are the Ainur, and mightiest among them is Melkor. But that ye may know, and all the Ainur, that I am Iluvatar, those things that ye have sung, I will show them forth, that ye may see what ye have done. And thou, Melkor, shalt see, that no theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me. Nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined." And so, you perceive the entire history of Middle-earth, the entire history of our world in that creation story. And profoundly beautiful, profoundly moving, profoundly biblical. One of the most effective theodicies I think I've ever encountered. Theodicy is an attempt to solve the problem of evil. Explain. The third theme of Iluvatar takes the discordant notes of Melkor, weaves them back into the theme so that it finally ends on a harmonious note. And Melkor's attempt to hijack the symphony, although it creates discord for a while, ultimately fails. And then Iluvatar says, "Ea, let it be, you shall see what you have done." And the music unfolds now, the second time, as the history of the world. Oh yeah, I was so right. As a young high school boy in Red Oak, Georgia, in 1968. Brighter than I could then have even begun to realize. So, in conclusion, Tolkien's book is as profoundly Christian as was the man himself. The Christian worldview of the Lord of the Rings is buried much deeper below the surface, but its roots go down to the very foundations of that world. And I said, not completely tongue-in-cheek, that I read it every summer to restore my sanity after the assault upon it, that is the freshman essay. But I think the real reason I do that is because it nurtures in me those roots and makes them grow yet deeper every time I read it. It is there for those who have the eyes to see. Well, there are some books on the back table. They're not quite as good as The Lord of the Rings, but they're not bad. The one that you saw on that last slide, Mere Humanity, G.K. Chesterton, C.S. Lewis, and J.R.R. Tolkien on the human condition. That's the one most directly related to what we've been talking about. And if you found this discussion interesting and want to have more where it came from, that would be a good book to grab. But there are others as well, all of them wonderful. Here's one that I've learned I need to read from whenever I do this, because Stars Through the Clouds is the collected poetry of Donald Williams, this much poetry. And most people look at a book of modern poetry and they think, oh, what could possibly be there that I could possibly be interested in? Because modern poetry is deliberately incomprehensible and not very poetic. But I have put some really astounding innovations in this book. Things like meter and rhyme. And so I've discovered that if I just read a sample or two, people actually want to buy this. And so let me conclude with a poem about Tolkien. There's lots of difference. There's devotional poetry, there's nature poetry, there's hilarious limericks, there is a mythopoeic Arthurian legend, the true history of the Holy Grail, where you find out what really happened. Tennyson got it wrong. But this is called Lothlorien. And so if you've read The Lord of the Rings, you know the place I'm talking about, the kingdom of Galadriel, where elfendom was at its most beautiful and purest until the passing of the elves over the sea. From silver trunk the golden leaf blows to the old abandoned fief. For time the robber and the thief has brought the hidden realm to grief. The wonder is withdrawn. Now far beyond the western sea, the merry folk have gone to be naught but a fading memory in Caras Galadon. For untold years Galadriel did weave her magic and her spell, nor warg, nor orc, nor dragon fell could enter the enchanted vale until it was withdrawn. Now in the once protected wood, the evil mingles with the good, foul things that never could have stood in Caras Galadon. Now through the hushed and chilling air there rings no voice of minstrel fair, no melody of sweetness rare, no magic words beyond compare. The music is withdrawn. The happy sound of harper's glee sounds only far beyond the sea. The rasping raven's symphony fills Caras Galadon. In Caren Amrath, Arwen's tomb lies hidden in the gathering gloom. The Nifredil no longer bloom. She sleeps within that narrow room, all memory withdrawn. The sons to Aragorn she bore, they come to mourn her there no more. They sleep beneath the marble floor of cold and deep Rathdinnen, far from Caras Galadon. The lonely wanderer passes by. He sees there is no shelter nigh. The stars are twinkling in the sky. He groans and on the ground doth lie within his cloak withdrawn. The leaves are rustling on high. It seems to him they softly sigh a sad lament, he knows not why, in Caras Galadon. And that, my friends, is the story not just of Lothlorien, but of everything of beauty that we have built in this fallen Middle Earth. But my friends, there is light and beauty beyond the darkness which it cannot touch. And if we share Tolkien's faith in Christ, we shall live to see it. I believe there's some little tin trays passing.
They are. Can we show our appreciation for Dr. Williams?
for questions, if any.
Because I'd like people to at least be able to hear what the question is. Let's talk with Sophia.
I was wondering, you addressed Gandalf as a prophet, but the most obvious thing that I thought you might address, but you didn't in this, was him dying and then coming back to life.
Yeah, I could have gone that. I could have gone that direction too. Which is another one more piece of the puzzle. Yeah, and although that's not specifically a prophet thing, so it didn't quite fit my schema. But you're right to point that out. It's one more piece of evidence that adds to the case that these characters are not portraits of Christ, but they reflect elements of the Christian story, and that's part of what makes them who they are.
Here in the back.
Good point.
So you mentioned a little bit about Iluvatar and the Ainur, and certainly those of us who've read the Silmarillion are aware of those, and the Valar and the Maiar, and this whole spiritual world behind Middle-earth, and they're very much a presence in the First Age, and they're nowhere to be seen in the Third Age. And I was wondering why you thought Tolkien might have taken it that way, instead of having them be this, very hands-on God and angels that they were early on.
Now the Third Age is Middle-earth's present as far as the story is concerned, and consequently I think it represents our present. And so we don't live in the kind of age that sees God doing things like taking 600,000 people across the Red Sea on dry ground. God still works miracles every time one of us turned from our sins to accept the grace of God in Christ. A miracle of rebirth, just as miraculous as that crossing of the Red Sea took place. And God does other miracles too. But it's not his plan for this age to be present with us in that way. So I think the Third Age is intended to speak to our age. And so the powers are obviously still there. Bilbo was meant to find the ring, but they work through natural channels rather than being seen directly. So if you think of the First Age, it's kind of like the Old Testament. And the Third Age is more like our present compared to that. So God is still present, the angels are still present, but it's not an age of big miracles, because we've already tried that, and the people who lived with them very quickly started taking them for granted, and we have the word made more clear through the revelation of Christ in Scripture. So without at all saying that God isn't active now, he's not active in the same way. He's active actually in a better way. Because now the light has shone in the darkness and still calls us to itself. That's how I would tend to answer that. Good question.
Other questions? Yeah.
What can you say about leaf by niggle in terms of Tolkien's theology?
I'm sorry, once
What
again?
can you say about leaf by niggle as a...
Oh, leaf by niggle. Very interesting. Yeah. A picture of his view of the next life, I think. And I doubt he would want us to draw detailed conclusions about the nature of the next life from it. But I think the general import of it is that we often in this life do not know the significance of what we're doing. You know, Nigel was all focused on getting that painting done, and then it turns out taking care of his neighbor was what actually mattered. But the leaf survives, so the other thing wasn't wasted either, and God knows what he's doing. It's very difficult for us to see what our daily mundane acts are going to mean. And here Nigel was building that house in heaven all the whole time, and his neighbor ends up being important to him there in a way that he only grudgingly was here. The irony is rather delicious in that thing. Yeah.
Other question?
Don, I wonder if you could give us any insights of why Tolkien seems to write almost in code, in symbol, in imagery, even for Christians who are struggling to understand the theology of the Bible. Then you have some of these written in the symbolism that would reflect the Bible. Is it only a few that will really study this deep enough to understand the significance of it? And on the other hand, of people who will not study it like this, totally secular minded, is there any profit to them in moving them closer? Will it be realized that this is moving them closer to biblical revelation?
Well, I don't know that it's only a few, and I don't know that depth is the key, because I was getting peeks of it my very first time through. I was noticing things that resonated with with the content of my Christian worldview. And there are people who have studied it very deeply and missed it all. And so I think it's a matter of, I think The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien very much succeeded in making it very much like the world itself. That is, God is obvious everywhere, but we suppress that knowledge in unbelief unless we are given the eyes to see. And the profit of it, for me, I don't think Tolkien set out to write a theological work. He set out to tell a good story. But as he himself realized later, as he says in his letters, that one of his letters, that it's a profoundly Christian work. And I think it turned out that way because that's who he was. And the profit of it for me is that I don't know if code is the right word, because it's very simple things. Starlight, water, wood, stone, friendship. I mean, the things that carry the meaning, they're only a code in the way that creation itself is a code. The heavens declare the glory of God. And the profit of it for me is that it gives me, it irrigates my soul in such a way that all of those seeds of biblical truth have a chance to sink their roots more deeply. That's just my own testimony. That's the effect I believe it's had on me.
Almost like man-made art or creation as such enhances the truth that it represents.
It can, In Tolkien's case, I believe it does.
This isn't so much a question as it is a talking point for you. But there is an obvious absence in this trilogy, or in this one book, of religion. But we know that it's profoundly Christian. And my take on that is that it's so thoroughly Christian. It's so thoroughly rooted in what we have a hard time experiencing anymore in a compartmentalized Christianity, where we live our lives in compartments and we put Christianity over here. That for Tolkien, it's just so blanketed over the entire, not just the characters' lives, but over the entire creation, that even the absence of God and the angels in the third age isn't so much an absence, as you were saying, but as something that's now matured and taken for granted. Would you...
Not an absence, but a different mode of their presence.
Yeah, almost like a supersaturation of it. Would you speak to any experiences that you've had in dealing with people who have looked at The Lord of the Rings as... Well, you mentioned caricature, the goth that comes to see Lord of the Rings and to just hear about the dragons rather than the intention of the dragons by the author. To those who say, well, The Lord of the Rings is absent of religion, and so that's really a proof that it's just a fairy tale, versus the absence of religion being actually a positive for the Christian presence.
Well, I actually think it's not completely absent. There's that moment when Frodo and Sam are behind the waterfall with Faramir and his men, where they have a moment of silence looking to the west before the meal. And Frodo feels rustic and untutored because they don't do that in Hobbiton. And so I think it's very much like, I think religion is very much like Iluvatar himself. That is, Iluvatar is all over the Lord of the Rings, but you don't see it until you read the creation story in the Silmarillion, or a lot of people don't. And I only saw hints. But then once you read that creation story, it's like, oh my goodness, Iluvatar was the one who meant for Bilbo to find the ring. He has been active in the Lord of the Rings all along. But I had to read this before that really crystallized for me. And so you have the hints in the Lord of the Rings brought to clarity by the material in the Silmarillion. And so I think that moment is the same kind of thing insofar as there is a cultus of Iluvatar in Middle-earth. I'm using that word in a neutral sense. Insofar as there is formal worship of Iluvatar, it's just hinted at in the trilogy. But then, when you go back to the Silmarillion, you discover that the Númenóreans had the temple on Mount Middle-Tarma. And once you see that and then connect it to the hint, then you suddenly realize, oh my goodness, it's more there than I thought. I think providentially it's good. I think it's a good thing. And this is true of both Middle-earth and Narnia. In neither of them do you have, at least not in any obvious way, do you have a church. There's no church of Aslan. There's no worship of Aslan that's formal and corporate, although individuals, of course, worship him all the time. Same thing in Middle-earth. If you had put a church of Aslan in Narnia, it would have had to have been either liturgical or informal. It would have had to have been either hierarchical or congregational in government. I mean, you would have turned it into something denominational that would have made it more attractive to some Christians than others. I think for Lewis it was a very conscious decision. If I put anything like that in Narnia, it's going to completely wreck my whole mere Christian stance, that I'm not going to get into the differences between denominations. I don't think Tolkien had that same motivation. Had he done it, it would have been very Catholic, even as he was. But I think it's providential that he didn't, because that way we don't get caught up on those external differences. Do we practice paedo baptism or credo baptism? That's an important thing, but it's not what you want people thinking about when they're reading Narnia or The Lord of the Rings. And consequently, it's good that a formal cult is not seen. Because if you put it in there, it's got to be described one way or the other, and then people are either going to feel valorized in a way you don't want them to, or excluded in a way you don't want them to. And I'm not saying those are unimportant things. I think it's very important that we be faithful to a communion of faith that is concrete and specific and has developed its way of being faithful to Jesus, that commends itself to us as being true. And I think it's very important that we relate to each other rightly in terms of how we discuss those differences, because they're unavoidable. But fortunately, in fiction, they are avoidable. And I think it's to the good that Lewis and Tolkien, whether by wisdom or by chance, wrote it the way they did. Would have created stumbling blocks that didn't need to be there if they had put it in. But it is hinted in The Lord of the Rings, that moment behind the falls of Hinath Anu. Tell you that it's there. We're just not going to focus on it.
No? Question out? One more, Bob.
Okay.
Here.
Let's see what you think about this, that both Lewis and Tolkien were attempting to communicate to the general public, which is largely skeptical and not religious, and skeptical of religion, and the use of the imagination was their method to do that. So as we said, kind of get behind their skepticism, and I think they even said something like help people to experience realities in the mythology that they intellectually would deny. Is that a fair statement?
Well, Lewis tells us very explicitly that that's exactly what he was doing. He wrote the Narnia books to get past the watchful dragons that are guarding the way to people's hearts. And he did it because, in his own experience, it was reading George MacDonald that baptized his imagination, which is what paved the way for the later intellectual and volitional conversion. With Tolkien, I think his works work that way, but it's less clear that he was consciously doing that as a strategy the way Lewis was. I think it's likely that Lewis clearly, there are parts of the Narnia books where Lewis is certainly availing himself of the opportunity to sneak the gospel past those watchful dragons, and he knows what he's doing. You know, when he has Aslan say, "You got to know me here because you need to get to know me by my other name in your world," you know, that's pretty pointed. Tolkien may simply have been telling a story for its own sake, and then his Christian outlook on things finds its way in because that's the way he sees the world. And I'm more inclined to think that with Tolkien, he sort of realized after the fact, oh my goodness, I put a lot of my Christianity into this world. Now, with the creation story, he had to know what he was doing. But I think in general, definitely Lewis consciously and deliberately was sneaking past watchful dragons through the imagination. Tolkien, in effect, does the same thing, maybe a little bit less consciously and deliberately.
Silmarillion, or the creation story, was that actually written before The Lord of the Rings and then published far later?
Yes. The Silmarillion material is older. That's where the Middle-earth thing began. And then Tolkien wrote The Hobbit in the 30s as kind of a lark. I mean, he was grading those freshman papers. And he got bored, turned over, and on the back of one he wrote, in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. And then he had to figure out what that meant. And so the hobbit, he put the hobbit into Middle Earth, which he had already created, but at a later period. And then the Inklings and other people were nagging him for more hobbit. And so he eventually wrote The Lord of the Rings to satisfy that desire. In his mind, now The Lord of the Rings is what makes Tolkien great. 3 different polls in the year 2000 made him the writer of the century. One in the US, one in England, I think one in Australia. And he was far and away the writer of the 20th century, according to readers in all 3 of those polls, which made the English professors have a conniption. I mean, they had a conniption with a hissy fit in the middle of it, because they wanted it to be somebody like James Joyce. They wanted it to be somebody that you can't read without their help. But Tolkien deserved it. The Lord of the Rings is why. And the irony is that he thought of the Lord of the Rings as a diversion from the Silmarillion, which is his real project, and which he never finished. And fortunately, we have, Christopher edited it into presentable shape, and we have a lot of that background information there. There are also 10 other volumes, like 10 volumes of lost tales, different versions of some of those stories that Tolkien wrote and never told us which one was his final, because he probably never had one. And so all that's been published now, so you can go through it and make up your own mind. But yeah, it all started with Tolkien's desire to create a language. And that language was Elvish. And because Tolkien was a linguist, language was what he studied. And so he was trying to create a language because he thought that was the ultimate creativity. In the beginning was the word. And so to create a language would be the most creative thing to do. And then he realized that this language would never satisfy him as being like a real language unless it had a people to speak it. And that people would need a world to live in and a history. And they would need other people whose languages they could be related to, because that's the way a real language is. And so all of Middle Earth was created as an environment in which the Elvish language could exist. and that's basically where it came from. So that's why I say I kind of doubt that Tolkien was as deliberate and conscious about sneaking past the watchful dragons as Lewis, because for him it was all about everything goes back to the language. And that's why Middle Earth is so good. People always think about, wow, these names, where did he come up with so many really cool names? And in the providence of God, a lot more than that comes through. So,
Well, Dr. Williams, thank you very much. Let's show our appreciation one more time.
we can continue for a little while. I'll meet you at the book table.